What's the most disturbing secret in your family's history? Story 1. One of my uncles died as a baby, age 1, 1960. Everyone knows that he was left in the bath when my grandma went to answer the phone, and she came back to find that the water was too hot and he had burned to death in the bathtub. It turns out my grandma, who already had 2 children and probably wouldn't have made such a rookie mistake, had sent my aunt, age 4, and my other uncle, age 3, to take a nap. She was across the house on the phone, so she didn't hear them start the water to give my youngest uncle a bath. They were playing bath time and accidentally caused his death by scalding. Neither of them knows the truth or remembers it. My grandma won't tell them because she doesn't want them to blame themselves. I'm not sure why my mom knows, but she told me during a deep conversation about family issues. Story 2. Any semblance of my family's history, photos, records, heirlooms, property, etc., was wiped away by Pol Pot's regime. Anything left, a few family photos, necklaces, was smuggled out by each person who valued it. Around 80% of my family don't actually have memories of their birthdays, as many of them were adolescents surviving the years of the killing fields. So most of my family don't even know how old they are. Everything I know about my parents, uncles, aunts, and grandparents before the war comes from anecdotal recollections, and with only one surviving grandparent, it's hard to piece together a complete story. My siblings and I will literally be the only generation with any recorded existence in my family. Story 3. The first person in my family to immigrate to America was granted an enormous amount of land to help settle and lead a town in Virginia. 31 years later, he testified against his 2 eldest sons for skipping church 3 Sundays in a row. They were fined 100 acres of tobacco each. 2 weeks later, he threw the first stone in a public stoning that resulted in their deaths. They had been convicted of devil worship after skipping church 5 Sundays in a row. He was then forced to resign from all the public offices he held. The following Sunday, while everyone was at church, he and his only remaining son burned down every building in the town except for the church. They left town and set fire to every tobacco field that had been forfeited on their way to Texas. They changed the spelling of our last name when they settled in Texas. The only reason we know this happened is because census records show both of them mysteriously appearing in a town in Texas with an almost identical name, just spelled phonetically. They didn't even bother lying about their ages or where they came from. The surviving son had only one child who survived birth. That child later became a bank robber in his late 60s to pay for his own children to attend law school. Somehow, our family is now known for famous lawyers, not the first 3 generations of criminals in America. Story 4. Not related to me, but there is a 90-plus-year-old German woman who is friends with my grandmother and has lived across from her for years. When I had to write a thesis paper, I asked if she was willing to share part of her story for my research. She took a few days to respond, but agreed to do it on the condition that her grandkids would get to read the interview when they turned 18. She was barely 17 years old when the war began, and her entire family, except for her mother, was male, 2 brothers, and a father. So they were all eventually conscripted into service. None of them survived past 1944. In early 1943, an Allied bomb exploded next to their house in Hamburg, and she broke her back, immobilized for 13 months in a full body cast. She relearned to walk just in time for the Eastern Front to reach the hospital she had been transferred to. She didn't say it happened to her, but she told me Russian soldiers came in, killed all the men and boys, and assaulted many of the women. A Russian machine gunner killed all the babies in the maternity ward, and for good measure, they burned the hospital down, leaving many still inside to die. She said she still remembers one Red Army soldier laughing as he walked by, remarking that the forward units hadn't left anything for them to shoot. "The sound never leaves me," she said. Still very weak from her injuries and unaware of her family's whereabouts, she had to fend for herself from 1945 until late 1946. She told me about checking the pockets of dead bodies for scraps of food or foreign currency, eating things I couldn't even imagine. In early 1946, she contacted the American Army, who accessed surviving records for German citizens. There, she learned the Nazis had listed her entire family as deceased, so she traveled to Berlin to try to gain residence in the American sector and find work. Her description of Germany during that trip sounded like something out of The Road. There were hardly any buildings not bombed, burned, or riddled with bullets. Bodies lay everywhere, and she suffered constant abuse along the way due to her blonde hair, seen as the face of Hitler's Germany. People threw rocks at her, called her a dog, and told her to die in a ditch. She alluded vaguely to more traumatic events, likely involving sexual assault, but her eyes said more than her words ever could. I didn't have the courage to ask her about the concentration camps. While working at a tailor shop in Berlin in 1946, the owner yelled at her to go to the counter to help a customer, an abusive former soldier with a drinking problem. When she walked out, she thought another bomb had gone off and that she had died, because standing at the counter, reported dead for months, was her mother. She said no moment in her life has ever come close to the happiness she felt seeing her mother again. She called it a miracle. I'm not religious, but I can't explain it either. They both ended up getting an immigration exemption because they had relatives in the States. She told me the biggest shock was boarding a ship in England and realizing that Germans had bombed and killed just as many civilians as the Allies had. Living in Nazi Germany, many citizens never knew the full truth. She believed only the Allies bombed civilians until she saw the devastation in England. I saw the same hopelessness, despair, and destruction in England that I did in Germany. Had the people seen each other during the war, it wouldn't have lasted a day. Our only difference was language: British, French, German. We all suffered as equals. Children were the worst. Their eyes held a lifetime of suffering. I did that interview nearly 4 years ago, and I have never looked at the world the same way. I barely knew her as a 21-year-old student, but we hugged and cried, wrote letters back and forth until her arthritis became too severe. War is hell. War is pointless. The ends rarely justify the means. The Holocaust compounds the horrors of World War II, but really all war does is force people into unimaginable suffering. There is never truly a good reason to start a war. It taught me that history is one of the most important things to learn. We repeat so many of society's mistakes simply because we fail to understand what others have endured. Now I make an effort to know my neighbors. I think differently about people. What story might your boss, your neighbor, or your coworker have that would completely change how you see them? That little old lady might not just be a cranky woman who lives by your grandma. She might be a warrior at heart. She has 3 kids, 5 grandkids, and 2 great-grandkids now. She told me her life has never been better. Even though she has respiratory issues from exposure to chemicals during the war, I haven't spoken to her in a while since she moved to Texas with her family, but I wish her well every day. I was lucky enough to speak with her on Thanksgiving. I hope you find peace, Anna. Story 5. My grandpa told me stories about his time as a prisoner in Germany. He was a soldier after the Italian campaign in Greece. He was taken prisoner by the Germans after Italy signed the armistice with the Allies. I think he was there as part of the occupation forces. Thus becoming an enemy of Germany, he was taken somewhere in Poland to a labor camp. Most of the people there were soldiers like him. I think it wasn't meant to be an extermination camp. Even though many died due to starvation, illness, extreme fatigue, and so on, my grandpa told us that one time, 1 out of 5 doctors saved his life by touching his ankles and telling the others that he was still good for work. Arbeit gut is what he grasped from their conversation. Despite being extremely worn out, he told us a lot about his journey back home, but not much about his stay in the camp. I think he wanted to keep the worst parts to himself. After his return, he was so traumatized that he decided he would let himself die. Lying in bed for days without eating, he was convinced by his caring sisters and mother that this was not a good idea. He spent years without telling anyone anything about the war. My father and uncles knew very little about that experience. About 50 years passed before he started telling us anything. I was a child at the time. He died peacefully in his bed last April. His mind deteriorated rapidly during his final months, and during that time he often woke up in panic, saying he saw soldiers everywhere and people marching. That experience left a mark that haunted him until his last days. Story 6. My mom's uncle lived modestly in a trailer and had no regular job. Outside of a few manual labor gigs here and there, he would routinely fall behind on bills and often had his water and other utilities cut off or threatened to be. On several occasions, he would disappear to a large city 3 hours north of his home for a few days. Every time he came back, he had large amounts of cash. One night during a poker game, some people were talking trash and he mentioned that none of them knew what it was like to take someone's life. One of the people there was my mom's cousin, who claimed he overheard the conversation. Of course, they tried to get more information, but he wouldn't say anything else. Everyone in the family knew he had a knack for suddenly coming into a lot of money, but no one ever really knew how, other than maybe from gambling. He passed away about 10 years ago. I'm 37, and I just heard this story for the first time over Thanksgiving dinner last week. Story 7. My grandfather managed to get his 3 kids and his wife out of Europe just before the Nazis invaded their country. The rest of that side of my family, every single one, stayed behind and were killed in concentration camps. Decades later, after my grandparents had passed and even their children were quite old, we discovered a trove of letters, dozens of them. They were from those family members, clearly responding to my grandfather's repeated pleas to leave as well. Each and every one expressed certainty that they would be fine, and it seemed they thought my grandfather was overreacting or being paranoid. So many letters from so many people he had tried to save, and they just wouldn't let him. I never met my grandfather because he died of a mysterious condition shortly after they emigrated. Now that I think about it, considering the effort he made and the responses he received, I think he may have died of a broken heart. Story 8. My grandpa did 40 total months in country during the Vietnam conflict. He had 2 daughters, so he never felt comfortable opening up to them. He didn't open up to his wife or his therapist either. He just didn't think anyone would understand. Then I joined the Army, and he decided I was the one he would talk to. He told me many stories, but one stands out in particular. He said they were on a 3-week patrol near the Cambodian border, close to the 17th parallel. Before heading out, he had spoken to a platoon that had run a similar route. They warned that the local VC liked to send kids out with gifts for the GIs, sometimes hiding a grenade in a soda can to catch them off guard. So my grandpa is out there, and they stop to check their map. Some local children come out, and he notices a little girl holding a soda can. He yells for her to stop. His squad yells for her to stop. They're all pointing their weapons and shouting at her to stop. Grandpa fires a burst into the ground in front of her to scare her, but she keeps walking, so he makes the call and empties his magazine. It turned out to be just a regular soda can. That's not the most disturbing thing he ever told me, but it's the darkest story I'm willing to share. I was writing some of these down at first, but I eventually decided that some memories should leave this world with him. Story 9. There are objectively worse things in my family's history, but the most chilling was learning how my grandfather treated animals. He was considered a pillar of the community, well off, with a stable home life, and a responsible husband. For a while, they lived in what could be called a country estate. That large property came with a cat when they bought it. She was a barn cat, a mouser. Long after they sold the place, my mother and grandmother were reminiscing about it, remembered the cat, and wondered what had happened to her kittens. Smiling, he joined the conversation and said, "I asphyxiated them." Then he described how he bundled each litter of kittens into a bag and tied it to the car exhaust, letting the car idle until it was over. Then he buried them out back. Instead of ever getting the cat spayed, he let her keep having litters and did the same thing every time. He never tried to find homes for the kittens or take them to a shelter. Cost wasn't a barrier. This man had a country club membership and owned a yacht. Yet he was the type who was polite to waiters and a doting, loyal husband. My grandmother passed away when I was 19, and the only disagreement I ever saw between them didn't last 5 seconds. No one suspected he was capable of such cruelty. Not even his wife. When he finally admitted it, no one treated it like it mattered. I was in my teens, in the same room when that conversation happened. I sat in stunned silence and didn't know what to make of it for a long time. Story 10. My maternal great-grandparents, Sarah and Levi, had twins, a girl and a boy. My grandfather, Harrison, was their older brother. When I was working on my genealogy, I discovered the twins both died on the same day. Nobody in my family is sure why or how. Harrison didn't speak about it, but the rumor was that they may have accidentally suffocated somehow. My mom recalled hearing that they were placed on an open oven door to be kept warm. I guess it was a common thing to do in the 20s, 30s, and someone accidentally closed the oven door, pushing the twins inside as a result. Nobody knows the truth. Also, Levi worked for a carnation milk factory in the 30s or 40s and was involved in an accident. A piece of machinery hit him pretty hard in the head, so he was sent home. When he got home, he was tired, so he laid down for a nap and never woke up again. He likely suffered a fatal concussion. Harrison had to drop out of school as a teenager and start working to help support the family. Then in the 60s, Harrison was in a hospital waiting room complaining of chest pain. When he just collapsed, it was discovered he had a heart aneurysm. Back then it was usually fatal, but there just happened to be some students fresh out of med school at that hospital who had learned about a brand new surgical technique for aneurysms. They couldn't guarantee he would survive, and if he did, they had no idea how long he would live afterwards. It was purely experimental at that point, but my grandmother gave consent, so they did it. He ended up living for many more years, until he died in '88, when I was 2, from liver cancer that he refused to have treated. I was told it was because he saw his sister battle cancer and didn't want to suffer through a losing fight. My grandfather Harrison had a very difficult life, but he was deeply loved and is still missed by my family. My grandmother, his wife, finally rejoined him in 2012. Story 11. My dad wasn't aware that the woman he had been living with was his stepmother and not his biological mother until he was in his 20s. What happened was that my grandparents got divorced around the time my dad was 3 or so. Around that same time, my dad was hospitalized with third-degree burns after an unfortunate accident involving a pot of boiling water. When he returned home, a different woman was there. At first, he insisted that the woman wasn't his mother, but everyone, his father, aunts, and sisters, informed him that she was. So being a little kid, he just went along with it and eventually forgot. Their intention was to give him as normal a childhood as possible, since divorce was highly stigmatized in their culture at the time. Needless to say, my dad was shocked when he found out the truth while preparing his visa to come study in the U.S. The most heartbreaking part was that all his friends knew. It was common knowledge in their neighborhood, but never said anything because they assumed he already knew. He also found out that his older sisters had been visiting the biological mother almost weekly, but had always kept these visits secret from him. Story 12. I have 2 stories. The first, a second cousin with cognitive disabilities was reportedly inappropriate with neighborhood children as a teenager. The second, my step-grandpa had a family years before he was with my grandma. His 13-year-old daughter went on a week-long horseback camping trip through remote Utah mountains with his sister and her female friend. He helped her pack, and a week later went to pick her up. His sister told him they couldn't find her, that on the 3rd night she went to bed early in the tent, and when they woke up in the morning, she was gone. His sister hadn't called him or the police. She just finished the trip and went home, acting strangely and distant. She quickly stopped speaking to him altogether. They had been close before this, and he had no reason to think his daughter's aunt would ever do anything wrong. He called the authorities, hired a private investigator, and even spent 3 months on horseback searching. Years later, he brought in a cadaver dog, but with no luck. He spent the next 4 decades wondering what had happened to her. He said it took a long time to accept that she was likely gone. Eventually, investigators discovered that his sister and her friend were in a relationship, but nothing more. He suspected that his daughter may have been endangered because of their relationship and that something happened to her in the canyon. This tragedy eventually ruined his marriage, as he became consumed by guilt and obsession. 5 years ago, now in his 80s, he became seriously ill. When I asked if he was at peace with the thought of death, he said, "Yes, I finally get to go to heaven and see my Julia." Story 13. My mother-in-law's parents were most likely involved with the Southern mob in the 1950s, and her dad was murdered when she was 6 because of it. She doesn't talk about it much, and her mom passed away fairly young too, in a car accident, so we don't have many details. The story goes that her dad was shot while walking home. A day or 2 later, 2 men in suits came to her mother and told her that if she wanted to see her daughters grow up, she needed to leave immediately. Her mother packed only what was necessary. They piled a bunch of papers, We don't know what they were. My mother-in-law was only 6 at the time, in the center of the house and set it on fire. They ended up bouncing around the western states, never staying in one place too long, until they finally settled in Illinois. That's where my mother-in-law met my father-in-law at age 16 and became pregnant. Her mom never spoke of her husband again, out of fear, and passed away in a car accident about 10 years later. There weren't many relatives left from that side of the family, so we may never know the full truth. Story 14. One side of my dad's family often says how dysfunctional they are. At a funeral about 10 years ago, one of his cousins, R, was saying this to me. I then pointed him toward a scene across the room. Two clearly connected family groups with visible physical separation and a palpable sense of discomfort. I explained Dad's second cousin, from the other side of the family, had been married for 20 years. They had 2 kids and seemed happy. Then she discovered he was having an affair. With her niece? The niece looked nearly identical to her, just 20 years younger. The husband then left his wife and moved in with the niece. They got married and had 2 more children. The 4 children are sibling cousins once removed. The aunt and niece no longer speak, nor do the original wife and her sister, who for some reason supported her daughter in the affair and eventual marriage to her uncle by marriage. I use this as Exhibit A for why there are families more dysfunctional than R. Ison. Now we're 10 years on, R's younger brother D passed away from an overdose when he couldn't overcome his addiction. AR was always far too judgmental about D, in my opinion, and in a final twist of family dysfunction, guess who's now starting a prison term related to possession of illegal digital content? That's right, D may have struggled with addiction, but he wasn't hurting anyone else. Turns out R was right after all. His side of the family might just be the most troubled, even more than the one with the bizarre marriage and family dynamic. Story 15. My aunt took in my cousin who has ongoing mental health challenges, specifics unknown. About 15 years ago when he was a young teen, he unintentionally became involved with someone who had a negative influence on him. Lacking proper guidance or understanding, he didn't realize the seriousness of the situation. Eventually, he spoke to a stranger about it. That person alerted the authorities, and my cousin's statement ended up playing a role in exposing a larger operation. He later won a state-prosecuted case for millions of dollars, with the funds set aside for his medical care and counseling, and to be fully available to him when he turned 18. However, my aunt is completely in control of his life. She manages his bank accounts, gives him a job she doesn't pay him for, controls what he eats, and treats him like a toddler. He's an adult and has the ability to function like one. But she used all the money from the case on herself and her other children. They spent all of it. That money funded vacations, paid for her favorite daughter's wedding, and supported a shady business they used to scam people and evade taxes. So I guess that's my personal top contender for worst family event. Though sadly, there are others that come close. Story 16. This isn't technically about my family, but rather the property that belongs to my family. My grandmother's old land, where I now live, has been in our family for almost 100 years. In the 1880s, a religious cult leader lived here with his wife and 2 daughters. He came to believe that he was an incarnation of the Archangel Michael and that Jesus wanted him to offer one of his daughters as a sacrifice. So one day, he harmed her fatally on the kitchen table. He then called the rest of the cult members to the house. Most of them were horrified by what he had done. The sheriff eventually arrived on horseback and arrested both him and his wife. We're still trying to uncover the full story, but we know bits and pieces. The house I live in now was originally one of their barns. The cult supposedly burned down the main house, but we still find evidence. Charred bricks, melted glass, rusted utensils, fragments of porcelain, metal barrel bands, and other remnants from that time. Story 17. This disturbing part of my family history splits into 2 periods. Before I was born, in about 5 or 6 years ago, my great-uncle struggled with addiction to hero from the time my mom was 7 until she was 27. 2 painful decades before getting clean, he was broke and living on the streets, using any needle he could find. Fast forward 5 or 6 years ago, when I was around 12 years old. This is where things got even more difficult. I used to visit my great-uncle every couple of months. By then, he had been sober for 14 years, but each time I saw him, he looked thinner and thinner. In less than a year, he went from a healthy 180 pounds to a skeletal 68 pounds. One day I visited his townhouse and something felt extremely off. He looked worse than ever. It's an image I'll never forget. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks and temples, bony elbows and fingers, knees like baseballs and thin limbs. His smile was kind, but it carried a deep sadness. Something told me it would be the last time I'd see him. And the next week, my mom told me he had passed away. It turned out he had been suffering from hepatitis C for a long time, likely from the needles he had used during his addiction. As difficult as stories about addiction can be, it's important to remember that people struggling with these issues often need more support than we realize. Story 18. I'm a Native American living in rural Canada, and almost every other Indigenous person I know carries a dark history. On both sides of my family, my grandparents are residential school survivors. I've heard horrifying stories involving addiction and domestic abuse. One example, my grandfather dragging my grandmother by her hair while driving down the road. My dad is a recovering alcoholic who was extremely abusive. He and my mom used to drink, fight, and chase each other with vehicles and even knives. My uncles and aunts behaved in much the same way. My cousins and I have grown up with psychological scars, and we often share the horror stories our parents left us with. It's a cycle that never seems to end, and I hope to be the one to break it. But I too carry the mental burdens left by generational trauma. Residential schools and cultural erasure aren't something you just get over. Anyone who says that shows a complete lack of empathy and understanding. Story 19. The most disturbing thing in recent family history is that my grandmother and grandfather were always believed to have had just one child. My father, several years ago, I discovered they actually had another child before him, a son. After asking around a bit, I eventually learned the full story. Back in the early 1970s, my grandfather had a drinking problem. While he was a good man when sober, he apparently became unrecognizable when intoxicated and would often lash out at my grandmother. When she became pregnant, the violence stopped for a while, until one night, when she was around 7 months along, he came home extremely drunk and already angry about something, which only made things worse. He started hitting her, and at one point did something, I'm still not sure exactly what, it was difficult for her to talk about, that caused premature labor from the trauma. He refused to let her leave or use the phone. She eventually passed out, and when she came to, her body had already gone into labor. Only then was she allowed to call for help. But it was too late. My uncle died before they made it to the hospital. No one except my grandparents and her mother ever knew the full story. Until she shared it with me, he doesn't even have a plot in the cemetery. At the time, policy dictated that the body of a premature baby be incinerated as medical waste. But because her mother worked as a nurse in that hospital, she was able to pull some strings. She retrieved the baby's body and buried him at the foot of her grandfather's grave. The only person she felt wouldn't judge her. Why she thought others would be angry isn't entirely clear, but grief is complicated. So yes, I have an uncle no one knows about but me. Story 20. My grandmother was a preteen when she escaped Ukraine during World War II. Only she and her mother made it out alive. She witnessed her father being shot, and her brother disappeared one day while out riding a horse, likely captured and never seen again. When they arrived in England, my grandmother was 16. One of the refugee camp officers fell in love with her and threatened to deport her mother to Siberia unless she married him. She agreed, and they married. He then subjected her to daily abuse. Once he even knocked out several of her teeth, and she had to go to the dentist downstairs from her apartment. They eventually immigrated to Canada, and she was able to escape with the help of a lawyer friend. She traveled from Edmonton to Toronto, where she met my grandfather and fell in love. Her first husband spent years trying to find her. She eventually married my grandfather, though she was never legally divorced, and had my dad and aunt. She wrote a book that was published by a small Ukrainian publisher, covering only the first half of her story. None of the abuse was mentioned. The rest of the story, everything she endured, is known only to me. Story 21. Not exactly my family, but part of my stepdad's family. His brother married a kind woman and then started an affair. With her sister one day while pregnant, his wife had an accident and both she and the unborn baby passed away. A few months later, he married his sister-in-law now. This family holds very strict beliefs that widows and widowers should never remarry. So the fact that they now act like the first wife never existed and treat this couple as if they are saints is beyond strange. When their elderly mother could no longer care for herself, they decided to have someone move in to help her. He didn't allow anyone else to be involved in choosing a caregiver. He chose a Cuban woman himself. Their mother didn't like her, claimed she was stealing from her, and experienced daily panic attacks when someone suggested they find someone else. Whether the woman was stealing or not, the elderly mother clearly felt unsafe. He became enraged. Of course, he didn't want to replace her because he was having an affair with her, so she stayed and no other arrangements were made for the mother's comfort. They refused to consider a retirement home, saying it would be cruel, as if letting her live in constant fear wasn't. At the same time, he was managing their mother's finances, which meant he was stealing from her regularly. But no one spoke up, because acknowledging that would mean admitting the family wasn't perfect. And they couldn't have that. He's the type who always needs to feel smarter than everyone else. And he and his wife's charged sister-in-law eventually joined some strange spiritual group. They planned to move to South America to serve their leader after retirement. Karma caught up. He was diagnosed with cancer in its early stages. But they didn't believe in doctors, so instead of treatment, he saw a shaman who told him it was just indigestion. He stopped eating poisonous foods like potatoes, tomatoes, meat, and dairy. 2 years later, looking skeletal and in palliative care, they insisted he looked great and just needed to hike some mountains to rebuild muscle. He was transferred to a smaller hospital, locally known as where people go to die. And they were thrilled, thinking the bigger garden would cure him. He was still berating family members and complaining about their food the day before he passed. Even on his last day, no one was allowed to say he had cancer or that he was dying. It was just indigestion, and climbing a mountain would fix it. He's been gone over a year, and I still feel like I can't say out loud what actually happened. Because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that the family isn't perfect. And we can't have that. Story 22. My great-aunt was married to a man who struggled with alcohol. She believed she had helped him change, and for a time she had. But relapses can happen. When he lost his job and started drinking again, she knew she had to leave. So one day she left work early, gathered the kids, and packed their bags. She then sent her youngest son to take out the trash one last time before they left. This involved driving a few miles down the road to the dump. Don't ask me why. While she was grabbing a few last-minute items, John, her husband, came home. He was drunk. He walked inside with a .38 and opened fire on his wife and 2 daughters. The youngest daughter, Dolly June, was shot once in the stomach but pretended to be dead. After he thought all the women were gone, their son returned home and tried to help his mother, but John shot him as well. He then dragged their bodies into the kitchen and left them there. Later, Dolly was found alive. She was the only survivor. My grandfather received the news of this tragedy, which happened outside Knoxville, Tennessee, and immediately left Charlotte, North Carolina, with my 15-year-old father and 2-year-old uncle. Authorities knew he intended to confront John and pulled him over at the state line. They searched thoroughly for a weapon, but my grandfather had hidden his pistol in my uncle's diaper. The police found nothing and let him go, but not before radioing ahead to ensure John was placed in protective custody. He was moved to a prison facility where he would be safe. I might not be here today if my grandfather had been arrested for what he was prepared to do. Story 23. My great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, was killed just a few months before she was born. The story passed down is that he was murdered by his own brother, who had gotten involved in bootlegging. My great-grandfather, on the other hand, had taken a more legitimate path, working in coal or steel. I can't remember exactly. His brother asked to borrow his truck multiple times, and knowing the kind of crowd his brother was involved with, he refused. One day after finishing work, my great-grandfather and a neighbor he carpooled with walked out to find the truck missing. With no other option, they began walking home down a road that's now a major highway out of the city. As they walked, a speeding vehicle came out of nowhere and hit my great-grandfather, who was walking closest to traffic. The neighbor, mostly unharmed, ran to get help, but it was too late. My great-grandfather had passed away. Sometime later, there was a family gathering or reunion. My great-great-grandmother attended, and so did the brother accused of being involved. While leaning against a second-story balcony, chatting with relatives, he spotted my great-great-grandmother walking by. He called out, asking why she wouldn't say hello to her own son. Without hesitation, she stormed over, shouted that she had no son and that he had killed him, and pushed him off the balcony. He survived the fall without injury, but I imagine it cast a dark shadow over the rest of the gathering. Story 24. Where southern Indiana, on the banks of the Ohio River across from Louisville. When 1890 to 1920, my great-great-grandparents owned a farm near the river. He lived in one house, she in another, separated by a creek. They had been separated. My great-great-grandfather was a known spiritualist and held seances. People across Clark County knew of his supposed abilities. He claimed he spoke to the spirits of Native Americans buried on the land. As it turns out, the land was indeed an ancient burial ground. He also believed in the legend of Prince Madoc from Wales, a tale about a Welsh prince who sailed to America, eventually settling in the Ohio River Valley. Local lore says the Shawnee people didn't take kindly to these settlers, known as yellowhairs, and ambushed many of them. My great-great-grandmother, who was half Shawnee, once told a local historian her family believed the Shawnee had been cursed by the Welsh settlers. Their daughter, my great-grandmother, lived in town and worked as a nanny and housekeeper for a widower who owned a grocery store. She married him after becoming pregnant with my great-aunt. My grandmother was born a year later. Shortly afterward, her husband passed away. Not long after that, my great-grandmother began experiencing seizures. She talked to people no one else could see, claimed to see ghosts in her father's house, and grew terrified of being alone. She began harming herself. Her father had her declared legally insane and committed to Central Hospital for the Insane in Indianapolis. Her daughters went to live with their grandmother. Years later, my great-great-grandfather was walking along railroad tracks between Louisville and Jeffersonville to visit a lady friend. As a train approached on one track, he stepped over to the second one, unaware another train was coming behind him. He was struck and killed instantly. The impact left little of him intact. A few years after that, my great-great-grandmother was killed by one of her grandsons. She lived with nearly a dozen relatives in a small farmhouse by the river. She controlled the household finances and kept cash locked in a dresser drawer. She wore the key around her neck. Her 19-year-old grandson first tried to smash the drawer with a crowbar. When that didn't work, he assaulted her, took the key, and robbed the drawer. She was found that evening. When the family returned from a baseball game, she had been wrapped in a bloody quilt and left on her bed. The police launched an immediate manhunt. They paused the search overnight, resumed at dawn, and eventually found the grandson camping further down the river. When officers approached, he ended his own life by ingesting a bottle of carbolic acid. The case was front-page news for several days that June. Not everyone believed the grandson was guilty. Some suspected her eldest son, who was known to be violent and had previously tried to harm a sibling. He claimed to have attended the baseball game alone and returned just before the others. But many questioned his story. Some believed he may have framed his own son. My great-grandmother later died alone in Central Hospital for the Insane. Her body was returned to Jeffersonville, where she was buried with the rest of the family. My grandmother ran away to Louisville shortly after, taking a job as domestic help with a wealthy pharmacist's family. They taught her table manners, how to speak properly, how to iron, and even sparked her love for reading. When my mother was a child, my grandmother said her parents had died young and that she went to Louisville at the suggestion of a family friend. She never revealed the full truth. It wasn't until my dad began researching our genealogy that my mom and her sister, then in their 70s, finally learned what really happened. Story 25. My paternal great-grandfather on his dad's side was a Grand Dragon in the KKK, and one of my great-uncles on my dad's mom's side still has the robe he was supposed to be initiated with. On my maternal side, my grandfather witnessed someone take his father's life. Apparently, my great-grandfather was very outspoken against the Communist Party trying to take over Greece, and he got into an argument with a vocal member of the party. The next day, my grandfather went into town with his father to run errands. The man walked right up to my great-grandfather and ended his life on the spot, then walked away. The police didn't even try to do anything about it, and the whole incident traumatized my grandfather for the rest of his life. The last dark story also comes from my mother's side. My maternal grandmother lost her mom at a very young age. Her mother passed away during childbirth along with the baby. This left my great-grandfather with 5 children and no one to care for them while he worked. He remarried, choosing a younger woman with few prospects in hopes that she would raise the children and run the household. Unfortunately, this woman was horribly abusive, especially to the only girl in the family. My grandmother, she endured years of physical and psychological torment, even into adulthood. One day she was beaten so badly she couldn't hide it anymore. When my grandfather found out, he made it very clear that if anyone ever hurt his wife again, there would be serious consequences. Story 26. My mom's side of the family has a deeply painful history. My great-grandfather surely abused 2 of his 3 daughters. My grandmother was the one who wasn't harmed. After he passed away, my great-grandmother married his brother. The oldest daughter who had been abused later married a man who did the same thing to their children. When she found out, she left him and confided in my great-grandmother about what her father had done. 2 of those children ended up in jail for similar behavior, and both eventually passed away after long battles with cancer. In a way, some form of justice came. My other great-aunt vaguely hinted at experiencing abuse as well, but she didn't say anything directly until after my great-grandmother passed. In another horrific situation, my great-uncle had 2 children. It later came to light that the older brother was abusing his younger sister and had gotten her pregnant. She was forced to carry the pregnancy to term and give the baby up for adoption. Today, my great-uncle cannot understand why his daughter refuses to speak to him. Growing up, my mom kept us distant from her side of the family. I always thought it was just because of her parents' messy divorce. We only saw them at weddings or funerals, and my siblings and I were never allowed out of sight. As I got older, I started to suspect there was more to the story. I finally learned everything while planning my wedding and not wanting to invite relatives I barely knew. Now only a few are left from that side of the family. The great-uncle mentioned above, my grandma, a few second cousins struggling with addiction who pop up after jail time, my mom and one of her brothers. Story 27. My grandfather and grandmother had 4 children, but for years the rest of the family only knew about 3. My mom and 2 uncles. When I was 17, my grandmother finally broke down and told my mom that she had another daughter who had been placed for adoption before they moved. My grandfather had insisted they couldn't afford another child. It was hard to explain to family and 2 boys, both over 5 years old, why there was no baby. So, when one of my uncles was running through the kitchen and accidentally bumped into my grandmother late in her pregnancy, they used that incident as an explanation. They told everyone that the baby had been stillborn due to the fall. My mom eventually tracked down her sister, and the 2 were reunited. They look incredibly alike. She's now part of our family and holds no grudge against my grandmother. My uncle, the one who had been told he caused his sister's death, is still angry. If my grandfather were alive, he'd be angry with him too. We don't blame him. He carried that guilt for decades, thinking he was responsible for losing his sister. Story 28. For context, my parents were never married. They were only together for a short time. My mom is, for the most part, infertile. So it took her 7 attempts to have me. Under common law, some technicality we have in Texas, they are now considered married because they had a child together, even though they never intended to be together. And so began our problems. My parents absolutely despise each other. At times it got so bad they tried to hurt one another. My mom only wanted my dad as a free sperm donor, and my dad wanted something? I'm still not really sure. Either way, they both wanted me. Or more accurately, they wanted me away from the other. The first incident happened in Oklahoma, I think. My dad said he was picking me up. I was 2, being babysat, and he just drove off with me. The second incident was a counter-kidnapping during a tornado, or so my mom says. It sounds wild, but also oddly believable. On the 3rd attempt, my father pursued legal. I was very naive at the time, and he convinced me to say something serious about my mother in court. Yes, that's what the record shows. The plan failed, and the court ruled that neither parent was fit for custody. I was placed in foster care. The system in Texas was harsh. I lost everything I owned, except for one quilt I've kept close ever since. I ended up in a facility with older teens who had troubled pasts. Thankfully, I managed to keep a low profile. My mom thought there was nothing she could do, but my dad, being ex-military, decided to take matters into his own hands. He broke me out of foster care. He gathered as much of my stuff as he could, and we took off. It was technically considered kidnapping, and Texas was furious. And when Texas is angry, things get serious. Still, I'm oddly grateful. My next stop in foster care would have been with people dealing with serious substance abuse. We left Texas aiming for California, but ended up settling in Arizona. The next 4 years were surprisingly the most peaceful in my life. I discovered PC gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, and a bit of normalcy. That said, there were challenges. My dad was addicted to gaming and refused to get a car, so we walked everywhere. 10 miles with $400 worth of groceries became routine. It kept us fit, but summers were brutal. Then one Christmas, my dad told me he wasn't getting me any presents. Instead, he said he was giving me the best gift of all. On Christmas Eve, a car pulled up. It stopped at our stairwell, which was odd, so I went down to check. And there she was, my mom, with a little girl by her side. My sister, I didn't even know I had a sister. I was 11 years older. Apparently, my mom had been with a man she thought was good and tried to fix things with a child. He left because of the child. Still, she and my dad somehow reached a truce so she could visit for a week. That scared me. Two people who always fought finally agreed on something? That never happens. But that week was amazing. They got along, and I got to bond with a sister I never knew existed. Then her employer died by suicide, leaving her without income. And stranded, things spiraled slowly but steadily, growing more volatile. I tried to run away at one point. Phoenix PD caught me in Mesa. Supposedly, they had 20 officers, a lieutenant, and a captain searching. That part seems exaggerated, but Mesa is a 20-mile walk, so the rest checks out. Eventually, on the 4th of July, I got caught between their arguments. My dad was arrested, and my mom, sister, and I were evicted. We moved to Oregon, where her poor judgment in men struck again. The first time, I don't know what happened. I was gone for a week, and something serious occurred. The second time, she was with a man named Gene. I came home and found him hurting her. He came at me first, and though he landed the first hit, I ended up giving him a concussion that required staples in his head and neck. 2 weeks later, DHS stepped in. Now, about 2 years later, I'm still in foster care. Story 29. My maternal grandparents didn't want to be a family, or act like one. My grandfather had a few children with my grandmother, and when the youngest was about 5, he left. The children saw him only once after that. 15 years later, my grandmother drank. She drank before he left, after he left, and for decades to come. She would often say she was going to the store and then come back hours later, clearly intoxicated and empty-handed. Sometimes she disappeared for days, abandoning her children while they were still in school. On at least one occasion, my mom and her siblings came home from school to find the house completely empty. No furniture, nothing left. After calling neighbors and eventually the police, they found her. She had moved across town and forgot to tell the kids. Years later, after months of trying to track him down, the children located their father. They pulled into his driveway, got out, and announced who they were. He stepped inside the house, and his current wife came out with a rifle and began shooting at them. The next time they saw him was at his funeral, about a year and a half later. My grandmother never stopped drinking. That's how I remember her, always with a drink in hand. I recall riding with her in the early 80s along the Gulf Coast, watching her sip from a highball glass as she drove us through town. Story 30. My parents escaped a genocide. That's not the disturbing part, though. Before they did, my dad had been helping rural villages in his country and worked with the Red Cross. He was captured by the Viet Cong and placed in a labor camp for a long time. He told me about how he buried people every day and how he eventually gained the guards' trust and was put in charge of caring for the sick. During that time, he was secretly planning his escape while also helping the ill stay alive by stealing fruit and fish from nearby farms during the day. At some point, someone he knew betrayed him, and the guards began planning to execute him. He only escaped because some villagers liked him and asked him directly if he was the person in question, which he was. Somehow, my dad managed to escape a labor camp where his death had been imminent. He was hunted for a while afterward, too. I know I'm missing a lot of details, but my dad only told me the story once. When I was 25, I'm 30 now, and it came out of nowhere during Thanksgiving, so the details are scattered. The most disturbing thing he said was that he stopped fearing death after burying bodies every other day. Until that moment, I had no real idea what my parents had gone through. I had a vague sense, but most people don't survive situations like that. Story 31. My grandpa's sister had an affair in her 20s while working in another city. She became pregnant and couldn't pretend the child was her husband's. In desperation, she went to someone who performed illegal abortions. Something went wrong during the procedure, and she barely made it back to her brother, my grandpa, before she passed away in his arms, leaving behind two little girls. My grandpa always had a soft spot for them and supported them as best as he could. One of the girls later escaped an abusive marriage and cut contact with the family because they pressured her to get back together with her husband. When my grandpa died a year ago, my mom was convinced she saw that daughter at the funeral. She didn't get a chance to speak to her, and now that woman has vanished again. As for my grandpa, he was forced to fight in the German army during World War II. He wasn't German, and being forced to fight in a foreign army is considered a war crime. Had he refused or tried to desert, he or his family would have been sent to Germany for re-education. He was supposed to be deployed to Stalingrad but was injured in Kiev. A Russian doctor saved his life, but that same doctor was later killed by German soldiers. Another branch of the family carries its own trauma. My cousin was involved in a fatal hit and run that resulted in the death of a child. She turned herself in the next day, claiming she fled because she feared the people with the child would have attacked her. She did go to prison for it. Story 32. My great-grandfather survived the Bataan Death March when the Japanese invaded the Philippines during World War II. According to my father and grandfather, he had to catch food tossed to him by people on the roadside. His own brother was among them. He would capture rainwater in his military helmet, and when he didn't need water, he'd flip the helmet upside down and use his shirt underneath it to keep warm and prevent sickness. After enduring horrific conditions, he made it out alive. Barely. He was extremely malnourished when he was rescued. He sounds like such an inspiring person. He's still alive today, living in Manila, but sadly he's now too old to remember much about his life or to communicate well. My aunts and uncles used to bring him to their schools when they were younger so he could speak to their classes. It's unfortunate that I never got the chance to talk to him myself. Story 33. My dad was an alcoholic and addicted to hard drugs. He was on crack when I was born and wasn't at the hospital when his son was born because he was drunk. Back in 1997, when I was 3, we went to a game ranch in Georgia the day after my 3rd birthday. Both my dad and my uncle, my mom's only sibling, got drunk, and my father got physical when my uncle started insulting my mom. He punched him square in the face, and my Uncle D fell to his knees. The only thing I remember from that night is a paramedic blowing up a glove for me. My uncle was declared brain dead and taken off life support the next day, 2 days after my birthday. My dad eventually served time for involuntary manslaughter and came home in May 2002. On November 11th that same year, I walked into the living room after school while my mom was putting away groceries. She told me that night I said Daddy was sleeping funny, but he wasn't sleeping. I was sent to a neighbor's apartment while they tended to my father, and I knew he was gone. When I came outside a couple of hours later and saw my mom's tear-streaked face glowing under the streetlight, I returned to the apartment once my mom found a house to help pack, but she never stepped into the apartment again. Story 34. My great-uncle used to smuggle substances from Colombia into southern Louisiana on a high-speed boat in the 1980s. He even had the look: white linen suits, flashy sunglasses, slick hair, and a huge mansion on the bayou. My dad remembers going to Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners at the mansion and says it looked almost exactly like the house from Scarface. Eventually, my uncle got caught and took a plea deal, giving up the names of everyone involved in the operation. The mansion was demolished, and he entered witness protection for the rest of his life. Also, my grandma, who just passed away, confessed to me a few weeks before she died that she had been involved with the Dixie Mafia from the 1960s until her death. She used to run a cannabis operation where a small plane would drop bales into the swamp and they'd go out in an airboat to retrieve them. She said she did other things too, but never fully explained. After she passed, my mom, cousin, and great-aunt had to call some of her friends to help dismantle her hidden grow setup, which included poppies and marijuana. Story 35. I used to stay at my grandparents' house every weekend. My grandfather was an alcoholic who constantly verbally abused my grandmother, though we never saw him physically harm her. When I was 9, I found out he had harmed my mom in her childhood, and that's why she never allowed my sister to stay there, only me. I never asked for details, but it had gone on for years, from her earliest memory until she was 15. A few years later, he left my grandmother and moved in with a woman from the Philippines whom he met at a betting shop. She quickly drained all his life savings, and my grandmother's too. When he had nothing left, my grandmother let him come back home. I'll never understand why she did, but it wasn't my place to question it. He returned to verbally abusing her and treating her poorly. After she died when I was 23, I never spoke to him again, not even at his funeral. When he passed a few years ago, I didn't go. I have no regrets about that decision. Story 36. My great-grandfather immigrated to Western Pennsylvania from Italy in the early 1900s. Somehow, he got into a feud with a man who ended up shooting him in the back. After recovering from the injury, he ran into that man's brother. The brother was later found deceased and hanging from a tree outside of town. My great-grandfather was charged with the crime. The twist? His wife, my great-grandmother, worked in the home of a powerful judge in that region. I've read newspaper clippings about the case, but I can't remember if he was acquitted or if the case just disappeared. Either way, he avoided conviction and immediately moved to Philadelphia. They ended up living in a home that, by all accounts, they shouldn't have been able to afford. My grandfather used to tell me that every Christmas, presents were delivered by the judge's family. It's always been strange. I don't know why that family cared for them so much. One theory is that my great-grandmother had some kind of leverage from working inside their household. Another is that the judge's son, who was close in age, might have had a relationship with her. Supporting that idea, their 13th child, my great-aunt, was born around the same time they moved to Philly. She was then sent, as an infant, to live with relatives about 20 miles south of the original town. Some believe she may have been the child of the judge's son, and that a deal was made. Support the family, and the child would be raised quietly elsewhere. Funny enough, I ended up going to college in that same small town, 20 miles south of where the family originally lived. Story 37. There's a legend in my family that my great-great-great-grandfather was a French-American fur trapper who married a Native American woman. That wouldn't be disturbing on its own, except that his uncle, my 4 times great-grand-uncle, supposedly had a notorious reputation as an Indian hunter. He was a bounty hunter or scout known for targeting Native Americans. Nobody knows if they ever met, but if they did, it must have been uncomfortable once he found out about the marriage. And there's more. My entire family essentially exists because of an affair. My great-grandmother came from a prominent East Coast family. She was married to a wealthy doctor, and, as was customary during World War I, volunteered at a military hospital. That's where she met my great-grandfather, a young man from Missouri and a bit of a war hero. They fell in love. She divorced her husband, a major scandal at the time, married my great-grandfather, and moved to Missouri. Her family completely disowned her. Tragically, my great-grandfather died a few years later of a heart attack, leaving her a widow with 3 children and no support system. One more story. My grandmother had a sister and 2 brothers. When their parents died, the brothers inherited the family farm in Illinois, including a beautiful old farmhouse on a hill. The sister had married and moved to California, but her husband turned out to be extremely abusive. She eventually left him, taking her 2 kids and returning to Illinois to be near her family. But when her brothers learned she was coming back, they dug a massive hole next to the farmhouse and bulldozed the entire place into it. They didn't want her living there, even though it had been in the family for at least 2 generations. My grandmother never talked about it with my mom. The sister ended up dying in poverty, while the 2 brothers later lost the farm in the 1980s due to bankruptcy. My grandmother managed to buy a small piece of the land when it went up for auction. Sadly, we just sold that land after her passing.